She bought a cracked tower for $500, and the whole village laughed. No one believed that there could be anything valuable in this ruin. But when she found a cave behind the tower, everything changed. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Winter had flattened the land into a single, colorless plain. The field stretched in every direction without fences or trees to interrupt it. Only a crust of frozen soil dusted with old snow that the wind kept scraping thin and redistributing in uneven streaks. The sky hung low and heavy, the kind of dull gray that never quite promised snowfall, yet never allowed light to break through. In the center of that emptiness stood the tower. It was not tall in any heroic sense, yet it dominated the landscape simply because nothing else rose to meet it. A cylindrical structure of rough, time-darkened stone, it looked as though it had been pushed up from the earth rather than built upon it. The stones were uneven, some smoothed by age, others chipped and fractured, all bound together by mortar that had long since lost its original color. From the ground to the roof ran a single vertical crack, clean and unwavering, splitting the tower as if a blade had once been pressed against it with deliberate force. The crack did not widen or wander. It simply ran straight, dividing the structure into two halves that leaned toward one another in quiet defiance. Behind the tower, the land rose almost imperceptibly into a low hill. From a distance, it appeared unremarkable, just another swell in the field, partially obscured by scrub and stones. No paths led to it. No signs marked its presence. Everything about the place suggested abandonment, not the dramatic kind that comes with ruin and collapse, but the quieter kind that follows indifference. The woman stood at the edge of the field, her coat pulled tight against the wind, and looked at the tower for a long time before taking a single step forward. She did not smile, nor did she frown. Her face carried the stillness of someone who had learned not to react too quickly to first impressions. At 45, she had cultivated that restraint carefully, shaped by years and environments where assumptions were costly and certainty was often a performance rather than a fact. The town lay several miles away, a scatter of houses huddled along a narrow road that no longer carried much traffic. A closed grocery store with sun-bleached signs sat near the entrance, its windows covered in dust and old flyers. Most of the people who still lived there were older, their routines reduced to essentials, their conversations recycled endlessly because nothing new ever seemed to happen. From that town, the tower was visible on clear days as a dark shape against the pale field, an object of mild curiosity and persistent mockery. They called it a foolish place, a useless thing. Some said it was an old agricultural structure. Others claimed it had once been a watchtower, though no one could explain what it would have been watching for. Over time, the explanations mattered less than the consensus that it was not worth thinking about. The tower had become a shorthand for waste, for mistakes that lingered, because no one cared enough to remove them. The woman had heard the laughter before she ever saw the building in person. It had followed her through the municipal office, where the heating barely worked and the floors creaked with every step. The clerk who processed the paperwork had raised his eyebrows when she mentioned the property, then let out a short, incredulous breath that might have been a laugh if he had not tried to smother it behind professionalism. "You know that thing," he had said, tapping his pen against the counter. "You're talking about the stone tower out past the fields." She nodded, already familiar with the tone. "That's not really a house," he continued. "It's not anything, really. No utilities, no status, no protections, just stone and problems." She had listened without interrupting, allowing him to list the reasons as if they were part of a ritual he had performed before, even though no one else had ever gone through with the purchase. The price had come last, delivered with the kind of casual dismissal reserved for jokes that were no longer funny. $500. Less than the cost of removing the structure safely, less than the legal fees required to argue about its fate. The number was not an offer so much as an admission that the town wanted the tower gone from its responsibilities, if not from the land itself. She signed anyway. The contract was thick for something so cheap, its pages filled with language designed to protect everyone but her. There were clauses that absolved the municipality of liability, paragraphs that acknowledged the structure's unstable condition, and signatures confirming that she understood the risks of injury, collapse, and isolation. The clerk slid the papers toward her with a look that suggested he expected her to change her mind at the last moment, perhaps embarrassed by her own determination. She did not. The pen felt heavier than it should have, its ink dark against the page. With each signature, the laughter from the room behind her seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet weight of decision. When it was done, the clerk stamped the final page and pushed a copy toward her, shaking his head slightly, as if witnessing a stubborn act of defiance rather than a legal transaction. Outside, two men who had been waiting for unrelated business glanced at her as she passed. One of them smiled, the kind of smile that carried amusement without malice. "You really bought it?" he asked. She stopped, turned, and met his eyes. "Yes." "In winter?" the other added, incredulous. "Yes." They laughed then, openly, without bothering to lower their voices. It was not cruel laughter, not sharp or hostile. It was the laughter of people confident that reality would eventually prove them right. Driving out to the field that afternoon, she replayed the sound in her mind, not with anger, but with curiosity. Laughter had followed her before, though rarely for reasons this simple. She had learned long ago that people laughed when they felt certain and feared being wrong. It was easier than asking questions. The road ended abruptly, giving way to hardened tracks, cut into the frozen ground. She parked at the edge of the field and walked the rest of the way, the wind pushing against her as if testing her resolve. The closer she came, the more the tower revealed itself, not as a ruin, but as a structure that had endured. The stones bore scars, yes, but they also carried the unmistakable logic of deliberate construction. This was not something thrown together. This was something planned. Inside, the air was colder, but strangely still. The sound of the wind diminished as soon as she crossed the threshold, replaced by a quiet that felt almost intentional. The interior was narrow, the walls thick, the floor uneven, but solid beneath her boots. Light entered through narrow openings higher up, casting pale, vertical bands across the stone. She stood there for several minutes without moving, allowing the space to speak in its own way. The crack in the wall was visible from within, a dark line that drew the eye upward. She traced it with her gaze, noting its precision, the way the stones on either side seemed to accommodate it rather than resist it. This, more than anything else, unsettled her expectations. Cracks born of failure were chaotic, spreading where material was weakest, following paths of least resistance. This one did not behave that way. It obeyed something else. As the cold settled into her bones, memories surfaced unbidden. She had stood in buildings like this before, though none so old or isolated. She had stood in concrete shells still smelling of wet cement, in steel frames vibrating with machinery, in corridors where alarms had once sounded too late. She had been the one asked to sign off, to certify safety where safety was conditional and truth inconvenient. She remembered the meeting where everything had changed, the polished table, the calm voices, the presentation that skipped over critical data, as if omission were a technical detail rather than a moral choice. She had spoken then, carefully, professionally, outlining the risks, the potential failures, the scenarios no one wanted to imagine. When they asked her to revise the report, she had refused. After the collapse, after the investigations and the hearings, her name had remained attached to the project longer than anyone else's. It was easier to sacrifice the engineer who would not cooperate than to dismantle the system that demanded cooperation at any cost. She lost her position, then her credibility, then the life that had been built on both. Standing in the tower now, she felt none of that bitterness, only a quiet recognition. Structures failed when people pretended they were something they were not. This tower made no such pretense. It bore its damage openly, incorporated it into its existence. That first night, she slept on a narrow cot near the wall, wrapped in layers of clothing, listening to the wind circle the stone. The crack loomed above her, catching faint light from the openings above. It did not widen. It did not shift. It simply existed, steady and unashamed. As she drifted toward sleep, the laughter from the town seemed distant and irrelevant. The tower did not laugh. It waited. Morning came without ceremony. There was no sunrise she could see from inside the tower, only a gradual thinning of the darkness and a pale, cold light seeping through the narrow openings high in the stone. The air inside felt unchanged, as if night and day had little authority here. She woke stiff and cold, every joint protesting the unfamiliar hardness of the place, yet there was no panic in her body, no instinctive urge to flee. Instead, there was a measured awareness, the kind that came from years of beginning work days in unfinished structures, where comfort was secondary to observation. She rose slowly, testing her balance on the uneven floor, and moved toward the wall where the crack ran. Up close, it was even more unsettling than it had been the night before. The stones on either side were not crumbling, not shedding fragments the way damaged masonry usually did. They met the fracture with a kind of restraint, as though the crack were not an injury, but a boundary. She ran her gloved fingers along the edge and felt no looseness, no subtle vibration that might suggest imminent failure. Outside, the wind had not relented. It swept across the field in long, uninterrupted currents, carrying fine grains of ice that stung exposed skin. The tower absorbed the sound rather than amplifying it, muting the storm into a distant, constant presence. She stepped out briefly, scanning the horizon. Nothing had changed. No tracks marked the snow. No smoke rose from chimneys in the distance. The world remained indifferent to her arrival. She spent the first hours of the day on practical matters. Water had to be rationed carefully, supplies inventoried, heat managed without wasting fuel. Each task grounded her, drawing her attention away from abstract thoughts and toward the tangible realities of survival. Yet even as she worked, her eyes returned again and again to the structure around her. Habit had trained her to notice what others overlooked. Once her immediate needs were addressed, she began to study the tower with deliberate intent. Not as a shelter, not as a curiosity, but as a system. She walked the perimeter, counting stones, noting variations in size and placement. The mortar, though aged, retained an unexpected integrity, suggesting a composition richer and more carefully prepared than what would have been used for a simple agricultural outbuilding. The foundation disappeared into the frozen earth, but where it was exposed, it showed a depth that seemed excessive for the height above ground. Inside, she traced the spiral path of the interior, such as it was. There were no true floors, only changes in elevation where platforms might once have existed. Openings in the walls were narrow and irregularly spaced, their angles calculated to admit light without offering easy access. The interior geometry was not symmetrical, yet it followed a logic that resisted casual explanation. The crack, always the crack, demanded attention. She measured it with care, using simple tools and her own trained eye. It did not widen toward the base, as gravity and stress would normally dictate. It maintained a near-constant width from bottom to top. The stones along its path showed signs of having been cut to accommodate it, not split by force. This was not damage inflicted by time alone. By midday, the cold had sharpened. She returned inside, breath fogging the air, and sat on a low stone ledge to review her observations. The conclusion forming in her mind was uncomfortable in its implications. If the tower were truly as unstable as the town believed, it would not have endured decades of weather, frost, and neglect. If the crack were accidental, it would have spread, collapsed sections, announced its danger loudly. Instead, the tower stood. Not proudly, perhaps, but stubbornly. The town's stories returned to her then, fragments she had overheard in passing. Someone had once tried to reinforce it, only to give up. Someone else had claimed it shifted at night, though no one had ever proven it. Over time, the stories had lost their specifics, hardening into a general belief that the place was unsafe, foolish, not worth understanding. She understood that process well. In her previous life, she had watched complex systems reduced to slogans and assumptions, inconvenient truths buried beneath consensus. When people did not want to know something, they laughed at it instead. Later that afternoon, she ventured farther around the tower, circling it slowly despite the cold. The land behind it rose slightly, forming a shallow slope that had likely gone unnoticed simply because it offered no dramatic features. Snow covered everything, smoothing the contours. But as she moved closer, she noticed irregularities. Stones clustered unnaturally in certain areas, as if deliberately piled rather than scattered by chance. The vegetation, sparse as it was in winter, thinned abruptly near the base of the slope. She paused, crouching to examine the ground. The snow here was thinner, damp in a way that contrasted with the surrounding frost. When she pressed her gloved hand against the soil beneath, she felt a faint warmth. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, yet it set her pulse quickening. Warmth in winter was never trivial. She straightened slowly, scanning the area again with renewed focus. The tower, the slope, the alignment between them. From a distance, the placement might have appeared arbitrary. Up close, it suggested intention. The back of the tower faced the rise directly, shielding it from view from the town and the road. Whatever lay beyond had been hidden not by walls or fences, but by indifference. The idea unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had not come here expecting discovery. She had come seeking quiet, perhaps redemption, certainly solitude. Yet her instincts, honed by years of reading spaces and structures, refused to ignore what she was seeing. As evening approached, the light faded quickly, swallowed by the heavy clouds. She returned inside, carrying with her a sense of restrained anticipation. The tower no longer felt merely like a refuge. It felt like a threshold. That night, sleep came fitfully. The wind rose and fell, its voice shifting as it passed over stone and open field. At times, she thought she heard deeper sounds, vibrations too low to be clearly identified. But each time she listened more closely, they resolved into the ordinary language of weather and structure. Still, the impression lingered that the tower was part of something larger, something not fully visible from where she lay. In the early hours, she woke suddenly, heart racing, convinced for a moment that the tower had moved. She sat up, listening intently. The silence that followed was complete, almost oppressive. No settling stones, no groans of stressed material. Nothing that indicated instability. She laughed quietly to herself then, a single breath of sound, quickly swallowed by the cold air. She understood the impulse that had driven the town's laughter. It was easier to mock what one didn't understand than to confront the possibility of having ignored something important for years. By morning, her decision had taken shape, firm and undeniable. She could not leave the anomaly behind her tower unexplored. Not now. Not after recognizing the signs she had once been paid to notice. She dressed with care, gathering tools and supplies, her movements deliberate. Stepping outside, she crossed the frozen ground toward the slope, the tower at her back like a silent witness. The wind tugged at her coat, as if urging her to reconsider, but she pressed on. Kneeling near the warm patch she had identified the day before, she brushed away snow and loose stones. Beneath them, the soil gave slightly, more than it should have in such cold. She paused, breath held, then began to clear the area in earnest. The first hint of open space came as a rush of air against her face, unmistakably warmer than the world around her. She froze, hand suspended mid-motion, every sense alert. The ground here did not simply conceal earth and rock, it concealed absence. Behind the tower, where no map marked anything of interest, the land breathed. She did not yet know what waited beneath the hill. She knew only that the tower, with its impossible crack and stubborn endurance, had not been built to stand alone. The first opening revealed itself reluctantly, as if the ground itself resisted being acknowledged. What began as a faint draft against her face soon became a narrow void between stones that had not settled naturally. She worked carefully, methodically, removing rocks one by one, mindful of the weight above her and the way frozen soil could deceive even an experienced eye. The air that escaped from the gap was unmistakably warmer, carrying a dry, mineral scent that did not belong to the open field behind the tower. When the space widened enough for her to peer inside, she stopped and let her eyes adjust. Darkness pressed back at her, dense and absolute, but it was not the kind of darkness that suggested decay or collapse. It felt contained, purposeful. She reached in with a gloved hand and felt empty space where solid ground should have been. The realization sent a quiet shiver through her, not of fear, but of recognition. She widened the opening slowly until she could crouch and step inside. The transition from open field to enclosed space was abrupt. The wind vanished at once, replaced by a stillness so complete it seemed almost artificial. Her breath echoed faintly, then was absorbed by the walls, leaving only the soft sound of her boots against compacted earth and stone. The temperature was noticeably higher, not warm but stable, a steady contrast to the biting cold she had left behind. She paused just inside the entrance, letting her senses recalibrate. The walls were close, too close for comfort, yet they felt solid beneath her touch. Running her hand along the surface, she realized the stone here was different from what she had seen above ground. It bore marks that were not entirely natural, subtle grooves and flattened planes that suggested human intervention long ago. Not recent, not crude, but deliberate. She switched on her headlamp, the beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The light revealed a passage that sloped gently downward, its floor compacted and relatively even. This was no random fissure formed by water or erosion alone. The angles were wrong for that. The space had been shaped, guided, improved upon. As she moved deeper, the scale of the place began to reveal itself. The passage widened gradually, allowing her to straighten from her crouch. In places, the ceiling rose high enough that her light could not immediately find its limits. The air remained dry, free of the damp chill she would have expected in a natural cave during winter. There was no dripping water, no pools collecting in depressions. Whatever this space was, it had been engineered to endure. Her footsteps slowed as she noticed the first unmistakable sign of prior human presence, a metal bracket embedded in the wall, rusted but intact. She stopped in front of it, shining her light directly on the object. The metal had been shaped to hold something, perhaps a cable or conduit, and its placement was too precise to be accidental. A few steps farther on, she found another, then another, spaced at regular intervals along the passage. The realization settled over her gradually. This was not a cave discovered and abandoned by chance. This was a place that had been used, maintained, and then deliberately forgotten. She thought of the tower again, its position relative to the slope, the way it shielded this area from view. The crack in its wall came back to her mind, that perfect vertical line that defied the randomness of decay. A structure above ground, a controlled void below. The connection between them was no longer a vague suspicion, but a growing certainty. The passage eventually opened into a larger chamber, and she stopped short at the threshold, breath catching despite her efforts to remain calm. The space before her was expansive, its dimensions far exceeding what she would have expected from the modest rise of land above. The floor was level, the walls reinforced in places with stonework that blended seamlessly with the natural rock. Along one side, she spotted the remnants of what might once have been tracks, narrow grooves worn into the ground, suggesting the movement of equipment or materials. She walked slowly along the perimeter, her light tracing the contours of the chamber. Here, more than anywhere else, the sense of purpose was unmistakable. This space had been designed to hold activity, not merely to exist. The absence of debris struck her as particularly telling. If the site had been abandoned hastily or violently, traces of that moment would remain. Instead, everything suggested an orderly withdrawal. The silence weighed on her as she stood there, aware of how far she was from the surface, from any immediate help. The thought did not frighten her, but it sharpened her focus. She had learned long ago that fear wasted energy better spent on awareness. Moving farther into the chamber, she noticed faint markings on the stone near one wall. They were difficult to see, faded almost beyond recognition, but when she brushed them lightly with her glove, lines emerged, forming numbers and symbols. Not graffiti, not random scratches, but technical notation. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the familiar structure of cataloging marks, the kind used in surveys and sample identification. She followed the markings to a recessed area where the wall had been cut back to form a shallow alcove. Inside lay the remains of containers, their lids rusted shut, their surfaces bearing the scars of time. She did not attempt to open them yet. The discovery alone was enough to confirm what she had begun to suspect. This place had been part of a project. She backed away from the containers and leaned against the cool stone, letting the implications sink in. A hidden underground complex, connected to a tower that had been dismissed as useless for decades. The laughter of the town echoed in her memory, not as sound, but as an attitude, a shared decision not to look too closely. Her training urged caution. Discoveries like this carried weight beyond personal curiosity. They intersected with histories, with interests that did not always remain in the past. She thought of her isolation, of the absence of cell service, of the winter roads that would make any sudden departure difficult. Still, retreat felt impossible now. Not because she was reckless, but because she recognized the significance of what she was standing in. This was not a curiosity to be mentioned casually over coffee. This was evidence of intention, of resources invested and then erased. She began to document what she saw, taking photographs, noting measurements, recording impressions in a small notebook she kept for such purposes. Each action steadied her, transformed uncertainty into data. The act of recording reminded her who she was, or perhaps who she had always been beneath the labels others had assigned her. As she worked, she noticed how the air moved within the chamber, circulating gently through unseen channels. Ventilation, still functioning after all this time. That alone suggested a level of planning that exceeded anything the town's stories had ever imagined. Eventually, fatigue forced her to consider turning back. She retraced her steps carefully, committing landmarks to memory, ensuring she could find her way again without hesitation. Emerging into the cold light of the field felt like waking from a vivid dream, though the ache in her muscles and the notes in her pocket testified to the reality of what lay beneath. She sealed the entrance as best she could for the moment, replacing stones and snow with care. The work was slow, but she refused to rush it. When she finished, the slope looked much as it had before, an unremarkable rise behind an unremarkable tower. Standing there, she looked back at the structure she now understood differently. The tower was not merely a building. It was a marker, a shield, perhaps even a warning. Its crack no longer appeared as a flaw, but as a signpost, a deliberate line dividing what was seen from what was hidden. As she returned inside to warm herself, she felt the first stirrings of something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Not hope, exactly, and not excitement, but a quiet, undeniable sense of purpose. The kind that came not from ambition, but from alignment. The tower had not stood alone, and now, neither did she. She did not return to the chamber immediately the next morning. The discovery was too large, too heavy to rush. Experience had taught her that the most dangerous mistakes were made not in ignorance, but in haste, disguised as confidence. Instead, she spent the early hours inside the tower, sitting near the wall where the crack divided the stone, reviewing her notes from the night before and rewriting them carefully, line by line, as if repetition might force the facts to settle into a shape she could fully grasp. The connection between the tower and the space beneath it no longer felt speculative. It felt structural. The alignment, the shielding of the slope from view, the stability of the underground airflow, all of it pointed toward a design that had been executed with patience and foresight. Whoever had built this place had not expected it to be admired. They had expected it to endure. By midday, she was ready to return underground, this time not as a discoverer, but as an investigator. She packed deliberately, choosing tools for measurement rather than excavation, documentation rather than intrusion. When she reopened the concealed entrance behind the tower, the same warm, dry breath of air greeted her, steady and unchanged, as if the earth itself had been waiting. Descending again into the passage, she felt the shift in her own posture. The initial awe had given way to discipline. Each step was measured, each observation recorded. She noted the angle of the descent, the consistency of the walls, the subtle reinforcement where natural stone gave way to worked surfaces. The workmanship was old, but not crude. It bore the marks of skilled hands operating under constraints, adapting to the rock rather than fighting it. In the main chamber, she set about her work systematically. She measured dimensions, pacing the space repeatedly to confirm her calculations. The chamber was larger than it appeared at first glance, its proportions deceptive in the limited beam of her headlamp. The floor was nearly level, an achievement that would have required sustained effort and planning. Along one wall, she found more of the narrow grooves she had noticed before, now unmistakably tracks, worn smooth by repeated use. She knelt beside them, running her fingers along the shallow channels, imagining the weight that must once have passed here. Equipment, containers, perhaps even people, moving back and forth between chambers whose purposes were now lost to time. The absence of debris continued to trouble her. This place had not been abandoned in chaos. It had been closed. Further along the chamber, she examined the recessed alcove more closely. The containers within were heavy, their metal casings corroded, but intact. She selected one carefully, and worked at the seal until it gave way with a reluctant groan. Inside, she found not the raw materials she had half expected, but carefully labeled samples, each secured in its own compartment. The labels were faded, written in a technical shorthand that took her several minutes to decipher. Her breath slowed as recognition dawned. These were geological samples, catalogued according to a system she had encountered only once before, early in her career, when she had been consulted on a project that never progressed beyond the planning stage. At the time, the proposal had been dismissed as impractical, its goals too ambitious, its costs unjustifiable. She had not thought of it in years. She photographed the labels, copying them into her notebook with care. The numbering suggested a broader archive, a network of data that extended beyond this single site. Yet here, in this forgotten chamber beneath an unremarkable field, the physical evidence remained. As she continued her survey, she discovered additional markings etched into the stone, almost invisible beneath layers of dust and mineral deposits. These were not labels, but instructions, directional indicators, warnings. Their language was technical, precise, and unmistakably official. The presence of such markings removed any lingering doubt she might have had. This was not a private venture or an improvised operation. It had been sanctioned, funded, and then deliberately erased from public consciousness. The implications pressed in on her from all sides. Projects of this scale did not vanish by accident. They were buried because someone had decided they were better left undiscovered. She moved deeper into the complex, following a secondary passage that branched off from the main chamber. This corridor was narrower, its ceiling lower, forcing her to crouch at times. Here, the walls bore more signs of reinforcement, metal supports embedded directly into the rock. Some had rusted through, others remained stubbornly intact, a testament to the quality of their manufacture. At the end of the corridor, she found another chamber, smaller than the first, but more refined. The walls here had been smoothed deliberately, the floor treated to prevent dust and slippage. In the center stood a platform, its surface scarred by marks that suggested prolonged use. She stood on it briefly, turning slowly, imagining the activity that might once have filled the space. It was here that she found the most telling evidence. Along the wall behind the platform, a series of charts had been etched directly into the stone. Though time had worn them down, their meaning was unmistakable to her trained eye. These were stress diagrams, load distributions, projections of structural behavior under extreme conditions. Not mining charts, not extraction data, but something else entirely. This place had not been built solely to harvest what lay beneath the earth. It had been built to observe how structures and materials behaved under isolation, pressure, and prolonged stress. The tower above was no mere marker. It was part of the experiment. She leaned against the wall, the weight of the realization settling over her. The crack in the tower, so precise and unwavering, was not a failure. It was a feature, a controlled fracture, designed to reveal rather than conceal, to respond to forces in predictable ways. The underground complex, with its stable air and reinforced chambers, existed to monitor, to test, to endure alongside it. Her thoughts returned, unbidden, to her own past, to the reports she had refused to falsify, the data that had been inconvenient, the warnings that had been dismissed as overly cautious. She had been punished not for being wrong, but for refusing to simplify reality to suit expectations. Here, beneath the ground, she saw the opposite impulse at work. Someone had once understood complexity deeply enough to build around it, to embrace it. And then, when circumstances changed, when priorities shifted, or truths became uncomfortable, they had chosen to forget. She collected samples carefully, selecting fragments of rock from areas that showed unusual density and composition. Preliminary inspection confirmed what she had begun to suspect. These were not common materials. Their structure hinted at properties that had only become valuable decades later, with advances in technology that demanded resilience under extreme conditions. What had once been dismissed as impractical or unprofitable now carried immense potential. As she worked, she felt the familiar tension between excitement and caution. Knowledge like this was power, but it was also risk. She understood, perhaps better than most, how systems reacted when forgotten projects resurfaced. Interests awakened, narratives shifted, accountability blurred. When she finally turned back toward the entrance, her notebook was full, her camera's memory nearly exhausted. The weight she carried now was not physical, but intellectual, ethical. She was no longer merely a woman living alone in a tower. She was the sole witness to a buried truth. Emerging into the open air once more, she sealed the entrance with even greater care than before. The field resumed its quiet, the wind sweeping across it without pause. From a distance, nothing had changed. The tower stood as it always had, cracked and overlooked. Inside, as she warmed herself and reviewed her findings yet again, she understood that her life had shifted irrevocably. The solitude she had sought was gone, replaced by responsibility. The truth beneath the ground was no longer content to remain hidden, and neither, she realized, was she. She did not yet know how she would proceed. Only that whatever came next would require patience, precision, and a refusal to be silenced. The tower had endured by accepting its fracture. Perhaps she would have to do the same. The days that followed were marked by restraint. She resisted the urge to act immediately, to announce what she had found, or to seek validation from anyone who might listen. Experience had taught her that discovery was only the first step, and often the least dangerous. What came after, when information began to move beyond the person who uncovered it, was where consequences gathered momentum. Winter still held the field in its grip, but its severity had softened slightly, enough to allow travel without constant risk. She made her first trip back to town quietly, driving the narrow road with the same measured care she applied to everything now. The tower remained behind her, standing as it always had, cracked and unimpressive to anyone who did not know what lay beyond it. In town, nothing had changed on the surface. The same faces appeared at the same hours, the same routines unfolded with predictable regularity. Yet she felt the difference immediately. She was no longer merely passing through. She carried something invisible that altered the way she observed every interaction, every casual exchange. Her first stop was not a public office, but a private one, a modest consulting firm several towns over, run by a geologist she had worked with briefly many years before. Their professional paths had crossed only once, but she remembered him as careful, skeptical, and unwilling to exaggerate findings for convenience. When she called, she did not explain much, only enough to spark interest, without inviting questions she was not ready to answer. They met in a small, cluttered office, lined with shelves of rock samples and aging textbooks. He listened as she spoke, his expression unreadable, interrupting only to ask for clarification. When she showed him the photographs and notes, his skepticism shifted, not into excitement, but into focus. "This isn't a hobby site," he said finally, tapping one of the images. "And it's not random." "I know," she replied. "What do you want from me?" "Confirmation," she said, quietly. They agreed on a limited engagement. He would review samples, verify compositions, and provide an independent assessment without filing reports or notifying any institutions. The arrangement suited both of them. Neither was interested in becoming a headline. As weeks passed, their correspondence grew more frequent, though still cautious. The results confirmed what she had suspected. The materials present beneath the field were rare, not in the sense of novelty, but in their combination of properties. They offered resilience under conditions that modern industries struggled to accommodate, from energy storage to advanced manufacturing. Decades earlier, the technology to exploit them effectively had not existed. Now, it did. Armed with confirmation, she turned her attention to the legal landscape. Ownership, she knew, was rarely as simple as possession, especially where underground resources were concerned. She consulted quietly with a lawyer specializing in land and mineral rights, presenting the situation hypothetically at first. The answers she received were cautiously encouraging. The entrance lay within her property. The structure above was hers outright. The underground space, unless previously claimed or restricted by statute, fell under her control. She requested a thorough title search, extending deeper into historical records than most transactions required. The process took time, unearthing documents that had not been examined in years. When the results came back, they revealed no existing claims, no active restrictions. The project that had once operated beneath the land had left remarkably little legal trace. It was as if someone had intended not only to bury the site physically, but to erase its existence on paper as well. With each confirmation, her position strengthened, but so did her awareness of the risks. She did not register the site publicly. She did not apply for permits or announce intentions. Instead, she began assembling a small circle of professionals, each engaged separately, each given only the information necessary for their task. A structural engineer reviewed the tower under the guise of historical preservation. An environmental consultant assessed the land for hypothetical development. The questions began to circulate quietly. Calls were returned more quickly than before. Meetings were offered at short notice. Interest, once non-existent, had awakened. The town noticed the change before it understood it. A new vehicle parked near the field one afternoon drew glances. Another appeared days later. People who had once laughed now watched with curiosity edged by unease. The tower had not changed, but attention had shifted around it, and that alone was enough to unsettle old assumptions. The first overt inquiry came from the municipal office, phrased as concern rather than suspicion. A representative stopped by, citing routine checks, asking casual questions about her plans. She answered politely, offering nothing beyond what was already public knowledge. The conversation ended without confrontation, but the visit confirmed what she had anticipated. Silence was no longer guaranteed. She accelerated her efforts carefully. Through intermediaries, she reached out to companies whose interests aligned with what lay beneath the field, framing the opportunity in abstract terms. Access to data, research partnerships, limited rights to study materials under controlled conditions. She did not offer ownership. She offered proximity. The response was immediate and measured. Meetings were requested in neutral locations. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. Conversations unfolded in precise language, heavy with caution and implication. Numbers were discussed obliquely at first, then more directly as confidence grew. She listened more than she spoke, allowing others to reveal their priorities through the questions they asked. Some wanted exclusivity. Others wanted influence. All wanted reassurance that the opportunity was legitimate and defensible. She provided evidence steadily, never all at once, never without context. As negotiations progressed, pressure mounted from unexpected directions. Old records surfaced in town archives. Someone remembered a relative who had once worked out there decades ago. A rumor circulated that the land had been misclassified. None of it amounted to a legal challenge, but the noise itself was telling. The laughter that had once dismissed the tower now struggled to reframe it as something that had always been valuable, always overlooked by mistake rather than design. She refused to engage with that narrative. Privately, she understood its purpose. If the past could be rewritten as ignorance rather than avoidance, responsibility could remain diffuse. The pivotal meeting took place in a city far from the field, in a conference room overlooking a river still choked with winter ice. Representatives from a technology firm sat across from her, their interest now fully revealed. They spoke of research potential, of applications that could redefine entire sectors. When the discussion turned to terms, she held her ground. She would not sell the land. She would not relinquish control. She would grant access, data, and limited extraction rights under strict oversight. In return, she demanded compensation commensurate with the value she had uncovered. The figure they eventually agreed upon was not presented as a lump sum, but as a sequence of commitments. Initial payments for research access, ongoing royalties tied to development milestones, options for expansion contingent on future findings. When the final numbers were tallied, the total exceeded $10 million. She felt no rush of triumph when the contracts were signed, only a quiet, steady sense of resolution. The money was not a reward for luck. It was acknowledgement of work done carefully, truth preserved, when it would have been easier to ignore it. News traveled quickly after that, though much of it was speculation. People in town spoke her name differently now, with a mixture of pride and resentment. Some claimed they had always known the tower was important. Others insisted it was unfair that she alone should benefit. The laughter, when it appeared at all, sounded forced. She returned to the tower one evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the field. The structure stood unchanged, its crack catching the fading light. Behind it, the concealed entrance remained hidden, guarded now by locks and protocols rather than neglect. Standing there, she understood that the true transformation had not been the land's value, but its visibility. What had been ignored was now undeniable. What had been laughed at demanded respect. The wind moved across the field as it always had, indifferent to contracts and figures. The tower absorbed it quietly. And for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself a small, private smile, not of victory, but of alignment. The laughter had stopped, not because she had silenced it, but because it no longer made sense. Spring arrived without announcement, slipping into the field the way light slips into a room when a door is left ajar. The snow did not vanish all at once. It thinned, retreated, broke apart into dark, uneven patches that revealed the soil beneath. The wind softened, though it never disappeared entirely, and the sky began to show depth again, layers of blue and pale gray instead of a single oppressive tone. From a distance, the tower looked exactly as it had all winter, unchanged, stubborn, cracked from base to roof, like a held breath that had never been released. She returned alone. The road was easier now, the ground no longer frozen hard enough to punish every step, but she walked the last stretch anyway, leaving the car behind at the edge of the field. It felt important to cross that distance on foot, to approach the tower the same way she had the first time, when it had been nothing more than a cheap structure everyone laughed at. The field smelled different now, damp and alive, carrying the quiet signals of growth. Birds moved through the air in low, quick arcs, indifferent to the history buried beneath their wings. She stopped a few paces from the entrance and looked up. The crack caught the sunlight, a pale line against the dark stone, neither widened nor diminished by the passing months. It had endured the winter storms, the shifting temperatures, the vibrations of activity beneath and around it. It stood as it always had, not despite its fracture, but with it. Inside, the tower was colder than the air outside, holding on to winter the way stone always did. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved through the familiar space, touching the walls as if greeting an old companion. The place no longer felt like refuge in the way it had during those first weeks, but it had not become irrelevant either. It was something else now, a marker of transition rather than isolation. She climbed slowly, stopping where the interior opened toward the narrow slits of light higher up. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams, stirred by her movement. She could hear the field beyond the walls, the muted sounds of wind and distant life. But the tower absorbed them gently, as it always had. There was comfort in that consistency. Behind the tower, the slope had changed. What had once been an unremarkable rise was now subtly defined by order. The concealed entrance to the underground complex remained hidden from casual view, but she knew exactly where it was, where the earth breathed differently, where the warmth rose from below. Security measures were in place now, discreet and unassuming, integrated into the landscape rather than imposed upon it. There were no signs, no fences, no declarations of importance. The site did not announce itself. It did not need to. She walked the perimeter slowly, taking in the relationship between tower and land with new eyes. What had once seemed accidental now revealed its logic clearly. The tower's position shielded the slope from the road, its mass breaking the wind and drawing attention away from the subtle irregularities behind it. Even the crack, she realized, played its part, a visual distraction that invited dismissal. People saw the fracture and assumed weakness. They did not look further. She thought of the contract signed in distant offices, the careful language, the precise boundaries drawn between access and ownership. The money had moved quietly, efficiently, transforming possibilities into realities without spectacle. $10 million had appeared on paper as a sequence of commitments, milestones, and obligations, not as a sudden miracle. It had changed her circumstances irrevocably, yet standing here, she felt none of the excess often associated with such figures. The field did not care. The tower did not care. And she found that she did not care either, not in the way others expected her to. What mattered was control. Control over what was revealed and what remained protected. Control over the narrative, over the pace at which truth emerged. For the first time in years, she was not reacting to systems built by others. She was shaping one of her own. She entered the underground complex once more, moving with practiced ease through passages that had once felt foreign. The air circulation remained steady, the chambers unchanged by the months of study and limited activity. Equipment had been installed carefully, minimally, respecting the integrity of the space rather than overwhelming it. Researchers came and went under strict conditions, guided by protocols she had helped design. The place hummed with restrained purpose, never loud, never careless. Standing in the main chamber, she rested her hand against the cool stone and closed her eyes briefly. Memory surfaced again, uninvited, but no longer painful. The meetings where her concerns had been dismissed. The reports rewritten without her consent. The quiet exile that followed when she refused to cooperate. She understood now, with a clarity that surprised her, that none of it had been wasted. The skills honed in those years, the patience learned under pressure, the insistence on accuracy over approval, all of it had led her here. This place beneath the ground was valuable not only because of the materials it held, but because it represented a philosophy she recognized deeply. Someone, decades earlier, had chosen to design for reality rather than convenience. They had built for stress, for isolation, for endurance. And when the world had not been ready for what they created, the structure had been left to wait, not destroyed, not exploited prematurely. The tower had waited with it. When she emerged again into the daylight, the sun was higher, warming the stone just enough to soften its edge. She circled the tower one last time, her gaze lingering on the crack. There had been suggestions from consultants and well-meaning advisors that it be repaired, sealed, hidden. It would be easy now, they said. Funds were available, expertise abundant. She had declined. The crack remained because it told the truth. It spoke of stress acknowledged rather than denied, of damage incorporated rather than concealed. It was a reminder, not of failure, but of honesty. She had no desire to erase it. In the town, attitudes had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Some people spoke of her with admiration now, others with quiet resentment. A few avoided the subject entirely, preferring the comfort of old routines to the discomfort of reconsideration. The tower had become a symbol again, but not the one it had been before. It no longer represented foolishness. It represented the possibility that something dismissed could, under the right gaze, reveal unexpected depth. She did not move back into the tower permanently. There were other places now, other responsibilities that required her presence. Yet she returned often, sometimes alone, sometimes with professionals whose respect was earned rather than assumed. Each visit grounded her, reminding her of the narrow margin between ignorance and understanding. On her final walk of the day, she stopped at the edge of the field and turned back for one last look. The tower stood against the open sky, cracked and unadorned, refusing both collapse and perfection. Behind it, unseen by most, the earth held its quiet complexity, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. She thought of the laughter that had followed her decision months ago. It had faded naturally, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. Laughter required certainty, and certainty had dissolved in the face of fact. As she turned away, the wind crossed the field once more, brushing against the stone, passing through the crack without resistance. The tower did not flinch. It had never needed to. And neither, she realized, had she. Subscribe to the channel to watch the next videos and discover more stories like this. Watch the upcoming episodes and explore other videos on the channel. Share this video with anyone who might find it worth watching.